Hello everyone, today we talk about the armored horse of the second half of 15th century Europe. So we're gonna take a look essentially at this very narrow timeline actually, because this is the moment in which the full plate bar, the four horses, appears. So this is normally marked as the second half of the 15th century is the moment in which the first finds, first of all, of complete examples of plate, of full plate armor for the horse barding appears. And this, however, is one of those topics that are interesting among the other things because they show you also how few we know about moments that are normally conceived as pretty relatively modern. So here we are almost in the Renaissance practically, so you would expect that certain transformations in this case in equipment, military equipment, are easily traceable. I mean, historically speaking, that there are enough sources, enough understanding of how such things happen. Well, this is not really true. It is true, definitely we have many different informations that sometimes for these narrower times, of course, we have a much higher degree of much higher concentration of sources that, say, we have for, I don't know, the whole Hellenistic era sometimes. But the point is that we still have difficulties to trace this, and the reason is that this is just the stage of an evolution, of a transformation that occurred very slowly, very progressively, and of which we can't see, in fact, most of how it really happened. So this is just for saying that also for the Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages, like in this case, we have often a very few informations, and we have to look at the broader picture, trying to say fill those gaps that leave indeed are left blank by the lack of evidence to understand how broader processes occurred. So in talking about the full plate armor for horse barding, we should make also a bit of prehistory of it, because as I just said, this is the moment to which full plate armor appears, also for horses. But plate armor for horses was out there since a very, very long time. As a matter of fact, we can say that plate armor is something that arguably always existed in a form or in another for horses, ever since horses have been domesticated and eventually trained and selected for warfare. Now it sounds strange because indeed we have, as moderns, we have this idea that, I don't know, if something was rare or unusual, it didn't exist. So that we get very picky and we stay on this timeline by saying, just like now, the full plate armor, in this case, appears only from the second half of the 15th century, which is right. But what is the full plate armor if not just the, the full process, the full realization of a much longer a completion of a process that had started since a lot of time before, telling the truth. Because especially in the West, we often hear also say, the first plate armor for horses is something we start seeing roughly from the very beginning of the 14th century, or maybe something before. And indeed, the very first evidence of such armor is difficult even to to say here it's the first one in absolute terms, because also in here I could think of the of Eastern Europe, for instance. I remembered when I was at university, I was reading a chronicle, Byzantine chronicle from Nicetas Choniates, and here it's said that for, I think it was the 12th century, the Hungarian heavy cavalry definitely had plate armor. I don't remember what term is used in Greek. I don't. Now I forgot. But just for saying that, for instance, in the Hungarian world, in the 12th century, so even an age where normally plate armor is not at least depicted, or at least we don't have any evidence, and a place for that is roughly also frameable into Western Europe, as telling the truth, Hungary is was still pretty much, especially at this time when the Byzantine Empire was actually still a big thing, was a bit halfway between Germany and Byzantium. But indeed, Hungary was not unaccessibly, I don't know, wealthier or let's say a place where feudalism was more structured or somewhere, but still, this Byzantine chronicle tells us that the Hungarians were plate armor. And is there anything strange in it? Of course not, because as we said before, every knight in history at a certain time might have thought to attach a plate armor of some sort over the horse. This is something that existed also in Roman times. The most usual, let's say, and also the most logical, obviously, was a component of the horse armor you could see was the chamfron. That is essentially the protection for the horse forehead, which is pretty normal, also because horses tend to, especially those who charge, to be pretty much exposed frontally to the enemy, just like soldiers, and the head naturally is this vital area, and you want that to be protected. But chest plate armor is something you find still in the ancient world and so on. And the idea is that stereotypically, the ancient world ends, and therefore nobody wears plate armor anymore, which is definitely false. And if you especially stick to the Byzantine East, or also you look, I don't know, the Near East and the steppes or Middle East, etc., you find plate armor. Plate armor meant naturally, in the most varied ways. Armor is also not to be understood as just the metal protection. It can be every sort. It can be of leather or of bone, of wood even. So as long as it is something that protects, it's armor. And actually the most widespread protection in this time was the kilted cloth. I mean, this sort of gambizon for horses, that was this caparison, I think it's called, that was worn by actually an extensively, much more than probably also what the iconographical sources depict, which, as we said now in several videos made about military history, is not definitely as effective as a plate, as a coat of plates, definitely. But it's still something that can deflect or absorb at least many of the, actually most of the bullets that are gonna arrive at you, that are usually not the full hit, full cinetically charged straight blow that hits at 90 degree, but it's essentially all these projectiles that bump into you even at a speed that it wouldn't, in fact, it wouldn't harm you if you're wearing even such a kilted armor and so on. But the idea of putting, in fact, a plate of some sort over yourself as a knight or as any other fighter, or over your horse, is being pretty much out there. And indeed there is, however, a problem, because in the sources we see that this horse armor generally lacks. So we don't think of the usual early medieval cavalrymen in Western Europe, and even in the High Middle Ages, or even for most of the Middle Ages actually, to be equipped with horse armor, at least in the form of metal plates attached chiefly to the hand or to the chest. But this was probably very widespread, and it becomes to be also pretty widespread from, in fact, perhaps the first actual evidence we have is the beginning of the 14th century. But throughout actually also the 13th century, we realized that horse armor in general, with mail and something that looks some other form of coat that looks suspiciously under the caparisons as something more rigid and more like a flat thing, so that could be actually even a group of several plates, starts becoming more frequent, and from the 13th century as well, as we were saying. The reason here it's relatively complex to tell, because it's also in here it's something we don't really know how military history how such things really worked into military history at a structural level. We have a very few units. Definitely Europe emerging from the early medieval times was definitely a poor world, as most of the Europe, the regions of the world, which meant that armor was something excruciatingly costly, expensive. Only a narrow elite could afford such a thing, and it was actually the elite of the elite, because what was normally the elite could be equipped essentially with, coat of mail, a sword, a shield, a helm, that were already something that, together with the horse as just as an animal, and the spare horse also for that usually they also had, was an enormous asset. I mean, there were entire units of land that corresponded to such a thing. It took lots of time and resources to even produce something like a coat of mail. So and this was a gear that indeed was already enough most of the times to protect the knight the way it is. The main criticism you can point out is that, why do we see in medieval history these fully armored knights at this point, especially during the 13th century, where even the helm basically encloses so that the face is completely covered, and these guys also began to increase their armor with plate parts, indeed, especially from the half of the 13th century, and the horses were normally unarmored. Well, this is difficult to explain, and actually I would better make another video specifically on this. But to make the long story short, at least my interpretation of it, and I think there is not much they can. It did the tactical role of cavalry. That definitely doesn't mean that horses were not targeted, nor that they were difficult to target, because they were difficult to target because objectively the horse has always been this very big target, especially for missile units. That is also, the horse is a fantastic animal. He's extremely resilient. It's especially these breeds were very well trained, very apt to warfare, but indeed it's also a very delicate animal. It can cripple extremely easily, so you can imagine all the things that can happen into a battle to be pretty devastating also for the horse. So the point though is that such heavy cavalry, especially that constituted the elite of all the armies, even numerically speaking, even in the feudal world, was definitely an elite that usually tended to fight in I can't say a pre-arranged fashion, but let's say that until the 13th, 14th century, and this is why, and this is incidentally in fact the same moment in which the barding for the horse becomes more widespread, or at least more, heavier, more intense. The heavy cavalry didn't have really much of a match on the battlefield. So at least, especially during the 13th century, even something before, sometime before, depending also where and in which parts of Europe, basically infantry was not a match anymore. Infantry had acquired sort of secondary role that, it was still vital for the same cavalry to operate together in coordination with the infantry, but up to the early 14th century we don't see, essentially from a couple of centuries before, a victory of infantries over cavalry alone. That means, pure armies of pure infantry that managed to defeat feudal armies. And by the way, this is something that starts happening roughly in the first half of the 14th century, where the commoners were stronger in Europe. Then after that, with the Black Death, also wipes out lots of them, demically speaking. There is a sort of refeudalization of warfare. In fact, you don't find many of the infantry victories up to practically the Renaissance warfare. So that, but we're going very far now. The point I was making is that cavalry in this feudal phase hadn't been engaging other units but cavalry, and the cavalry warfare in this sense was very dynamic. It mostly had to do with the cohesion of the formation, as always, really, but it was something pretty speedy, for which, you know, these cavalry units would kind of basically confront each other, face each other, trying to spot the weakest gaps in the line and so on, and eventually launching this very direct and sometimes also very narrow and small charges, surgically meant, let's say, to breach into that particular line. In fact, there were certain elite units of the same feudal elite that were pretty small, but they could charge very violently, open these gaps, also in very narrow parts of the formation, let the other cavalry to charge. So we will all talk about this sometime soon. I don't know when, actually, not necessarily soon, but these are all things I will discuss individually in entire videos, because they are very important. But let's say that at that point it was not much a matter of melee, because naturally cavalry also fought in melee, but most important thing was actually to charge information. And if you manage to smash the enemy formation to make it lose cohesion and so on, it's done. You don't even have to fight. This is something in the melee, I mean, this is something that it's often not got right, at least in, you know, people who are especially concentrated about the individuals, or many people who like military history tend to stick to the idea that it's everything how the individual fights. Actually, how the individual fights is almost irrelevant to the whole tactical scenarios. It's mostly how the formation works. So armor often in this, especially in this context, was worn mostly for something that flew in the air, that really was thrown at close distance, like, you know, a sword or an axe or something like that. And naturally charges could be very bloody. They could be carried out also against thickly packed formations of infantry. This happened also before, so naturally at that point cavalry would need a sort of protection, because melee could definitely answer in some way. But let's say that fights have always been incredibly short. Formations have rarely fought for more than a few minutes, and there was nothing of this kind of Hollywood melee where everybody is mixed, you know, chaotically and jumps around killing people. It's not really how it ever existed in history. It was always about this cohesion, this mass. So as long as heavier missile weapons basically pop out on the battlefield, such as crossbows, or better, let's say, infantries of commoners, for instance, that could, you know, trainedly fire against cavalry. This excuse me, this rain of crossbow bolts, indeed also the need for protection was pretty low, and in fact the spread of the crossbow is usually seen as the first reason for which basically not just horse armor but also armor in general has evolved, especially towards these forms of plate armor that were incredibly effective, because indeed there were bolts that could you know, penetrate even plate armor, seemingly were, but this was something extremely rare, and actually I've never found in any episode of military history a plate armor that is being pierced into a person who died in combat because a crossbow bolt or a, I don't know, longbow bolt hit into the plate armor. All the deaths you find is, you know, if the guy, I don't know, had risen his visor and arrow struck him in the face, or if he had certain open spots between especially the joint of the plate armor, something like that, with javelins and so on. But otherwise, you can argue that until the 16th century, practically every missile weapon that existed on the battlefields was well countered by the best armor that existed at the time. But the only problem that these heavily armored elite was definitely also a numerical elite, so the majority of the troops would be relatively lightly equipped. Telling the truth, especially towards the 15th century, we are used, especially from the at least manuscripts we have about the 100 Years' War, especially in fact at this point between in the French and English armies, we have this beautiful depiction, but it was pretty much like that like in the rest of Europe, even though which also here we should dedicate an entire video about it. You see that even common soldiers could be equipped with something, consistently hard, like brigantines, like full plate armor and so on, and that indeed the 15th century marks the period of greater armoredness, we can say, of in actually military history, I believe, and this is why also in fact the horse bard is at this point pops up out in full plate armor that will be abandoned actually after substantially a century, because roughly, I mean, this kind of horse armor at a certain point is rendered useless by the increase of firearms, so that theoretically, extremely heavy armor that could not be penetrated by bullets could exist, but it would have been so heavy and so costly that it practically would make these units useless. So that's, if you were wondering, also why eventually in Renaissance warfare plate armor is progressively abandoned, because it simply was better to invest into a musket than into a plate armor to be more effective overall as an army, and to also to have less casualties, paradoxically. So aside from this, so that's also in part to explain why the 15th century, why the second half of the 15th century. Going back to the thing of the horses, that I don't horse armor that I wasn't even imagining is, however, the idea that just as there is a bit of gap in time, because actually the first plate armor for the knights, so only the individual knight, without the horse, is something that starts appearing roughly from the mid 13th century. And if you're interested, I made a video specifically about it. That is, if you go into my medieval warfare playlist, actually made two that can be interesting under this point of view. One is Origins of the Western Code of Plates, a second half of the 13th century. The other one was actually also dealing with this, and also with cavalry especially. That was interesting because it takes well, one general thing was 13th century chivalry, scattered considerations, that also deals in part with this thing. The other one was the one of the, here it was, weighting of the late 13th century armor, the Ferraris seal of the Guild of St. George. These are three videos in which I more or less also talk profusely about this transformation of cavalry from in the second half of the 13th century towards something heavier, that also brought so many changes into warfare and tactics at that time, and deals with the weighting, in fact, of this armor complexively, so that you start finding many, I think the we have, I think, inventories in the very beginning of the 14th century that show us solid metal armor for croppers and flanks, interestingly enough. Then there is an illustration of such early plate armor in the so-called Holcomb picture Bible, dated to roughly the 20s of the 14th century. And in here we have essentially a horse and kilted armor, so with this material that could be either, I don't know, cotton or kilted cotton or leather, whatever, because sometimes from the depictions it's even difficult to tell what's the material about. In fact, this is a problem we have also for the 15th century, that sometimes we see this kind of plate armor for horses, but we don't know whether it's, for instance, boiled leather, the cuir bouilli, or if it is actual metal, steel plates. So, and in this Holcomb picture Bible, we have essentially this kilter armor with a single triangular plate covering the horse's chest. So this is also naturally where you would have found preferably this armor appearing, in the chest, just for the knights actually, because the plate armor develops initially for protecting the torso. So here for the horses it happens really the same way. And actually probably the very first plate armor was on the forehead of the horse as well. It was something in fact widespread in many other, but we lack specific evidence sometimes. But you know that there is a logic behind that makes you say, it was probably much more convenient to protect also the horse's head than the horse's chest in some ways. But this also depends on many questions that we cannot fully answer, because simply we are not 13th century knights. We don't know how it was. We don't know what was preferred, how really the practice of warfare would bring you to. And it's also a problem of sources, naturally, because that's the main point. We lack evidence, but we can also think in fact there were different dynamics. We don't see that. Also iconographic sources do not show us. Excuse me, I drink a little bit before I go on. So, we have this evidence, and then we start obviously seeing this plate armor always more widespread. Also in here, not an excessive number of depictions, not even up to the first evidence. We have a full plate armor in the second half of the 15th century, but we have other scattered evidence. We know from the 13th century that from certain actually from many sources, actually we have the seal of Roger de Quincy, the Earl of Winchester, and also we have Matthew Paris describing the Battle of Nuova Croce in Italy in 1237. We have an ordinance of Philip the Fair that all basically tell us, way or another, that the use of metal armor was pretty widespread. And actually the full coat of mail for horses also existed from the 13th, 14th century. Start finding, especially from the 14th, this it was extremely rare, though, still numerically speaking, this full mail armor for even the horse. And this was something extremely expensive, extremely heavy. Just think at all the consequences that this brought to him. That's why I quoted you those videos before, because just think about the horse that already has to carry a guy in full armor, and then you get him on a gambus on his own, a mail armor. This was the ultra elite. These were horses that could hardly ever even think to be launched full gallops. They were easily exhaustible. I mean, they were tougher breeds, naturally. They were more muscular. They were able to oxygenate themselves more with these large muscles and so on, but they do a very small, let's say, contained fort, and that's why this also was normally this was cavalry that was used with a very specific tactical role, because for any other thing like scouting, skirmishing, or even being a bit more mobile and dynamic on the battlefield, you couldn't wear such an armor. Of course you could push the horse to do it, but then it would be exhausted. You could not use it for what it was best fit for, that is launching this straight ordered and relatively also slow charge, more at pace than at gallop, actually, against the enemy. Actually, the normal pace was the counter. It was rarely more than 40-45 kilometers per hour in a cavalry charge. And I don't know if you've ever gone, I don't know if you've tried motorcycle, you go at 40-45 kilometers per hour and just think to impact something. You know you're gonna crush yourself badly. And plus, imagine that you have someone that is coming in the opposite direction at the same speed. So that also tells you why horses actually never bump, really, how cavalry charges were very rarely something really physical. This is another very important thing to remember. Do you think that actually these cavalry smashed at 40-45 kilometers per hour into another enemy formation? This basically never happened. It was all about the psychological effect that can crush an enemy formation even before impacting. So then you impact only when the formation is loosened enough for the horse just to flow in it and smash a bunch of guys, but not having this full resistance given by mass of thickly packed soldiers, also with pointy spears that you're pointing at you, because, by the way, horses will not run into the spears. So the also I like particularly tactics, as you already know if you follow me from some time. So it's a shame I haven't still discussed about these things in a dedicated video, but I give you these tiny bits of it because every time I explain these things, also for telling you how this armor practically was. And indeed, most of the armor was actually conceived mostly for protecting from bullets. Most of the times, especially one for cavalry, because this is the point the circle I was trying to close, is that how weren't horses armored? Even the heavy ones, usually, and just that tiny elite was armored with pieces of armor on it. Well, the idea is exactly this, is that if you keep this cavalry in reserve for most of the battle, especially for the end, you're making it intervene into moments in which, the skirmishes have already ended, like missile weapons have usually exhausted themselves. The enemy is shattered. There is hopefully more space also to practically to or at least a safer situation to charge in. I mean, not really safer in a sense, because usually these reserves were thrown into crucial moments of the battle, but at least in a moment in which the field was a bit more less energetic, cynetically speaking, because most of the forces had been exhausted, so you could launch this force on its own into a system that was relatively less reactive, and therefore hoping that this charge would smash the enemy at the only site. So what's the point of armoring a horse that indeed the best thing it can do is to remain, in that sense, it has just to charge straight and hopefully not to engage in a prolonged melee. It doesn't make sense to spend and to invest such a huge amount of money for covering a horse in mail or in armor in general if you're gonna make it stay in reserve. And you can argue, well, but these were still paradoxically the units that were more heavily armored. Well, this is definitely true, because it's not that these the one I drew was an ideal picture, these guys are just gonna charge straight, but even the same cavalry, can carry out several charges, and in the meanwhile you can be hit in some ways. There can definitely be missile weapons still around. Usually they are pretty serious situations. Still, the battle is not, just like taking a walk, so even there's always this inherent threat of danger. But this was avoided by the very elite, because they were essentially saying, okay, I'm not gonna die. Because indeed, if you see, especially before the 14th century, with the defeats of cavalry against the commoners, the mortality rate into combat, specifically, of this elite was extremely low. First of all, because it was much more profitable to capture an enemy, a nobleman alive, for ransoming him. So by killing him. Secondly, because the same noble would had the means and the resources to be better protected, and therefore would wanted to be sure to go into battle and surely risk his life, but the less as possible, let's say. So this is very very important also too. So the important thing here, we have other evidence, actually many other scattered details in between the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century, that something heavier was being built up. Another difficulty that we have sometimes is that given the lack of standardization of pre-industrial equipment, every soldier basically kind of wore a different type of equipment, especially knights, that were the ones who had their armor at this time, especially when economy was a bit more dynamic, and there was the maximum expansion of the economical, say also of local production and things like that. Before the mid of the 14th century, every knight would essentially customize his own armor the way he wanted, also for his horse. So the ways this armor was built naturally maintained certain standards, the way they were realized with this riveted plates. Especially you can see that from the specifically the knight armors, there are many types that are actually pretty similar to each other, but still they're all different in some way. So there could be very ingenious solutions. And another thing it's often overestimated, and some people even say it's fairy tale, is that it was actually plenty of leather armor at this point. It had always been so, especially for cavalry, because in cavalry there are greater forces that especially can you need this greater flexibility. You need also ingenious ways to remain attached to the saddle. That was a great concern, because falling from a horse is not really a thrilling experience, I can tell you, but it's definitely there were so many leather straps to maintain. Also this I'm sorry, I stop every once in a while now and can't keep it straight, because there are so many things that pop into my mind that we will have into my mind that we will necessarily have to discuss one day. But just to make the long story short, that's a progressive process. Okay, there is this progressive widening of an elite. It also brings to a tactical differentiation, because at this point, objectively, the military organization hadn't been extremely complicated. Basically, was a knight, they had a squire, and or two, depending also on the status and so on. And towards instead the 14th and 15th century, we have different kinds of units that also are formed as companies, that are basically all small autonomous tactical units that, when joined together into a battle, basically split up, so that they're deployed together. I don't know, the infantrymen with the crossbow with the crossbowmen, and so on, that give origin to units like the lanks, for instance, of the Renaissance time. So this unit that was already differentiated in so many ways. And cavalry necessarily gets specialized, because there is the heavier, ultra heavy guy that is not like, I don't know, in the 11th century, where he basically does everything by himself. And he literally dominates the battle on his own, just for being an individual fighter that knows definitely also and starts knowing how to fight extremely well in formation, but it's also extremely multitask, can mount his mount. The ultra elite in the later Middle Ages is a guy that basically is even literally lifted and put on the horse, and basically remains over it most of the time, at least ideally speaking, unless he doesn't fight in another context like a siege and so on. But there is this increasing tactical specialization, for which the heavy cavalry tends only to become heavy cavalry and to do specifically that. And then a lighter cavalry, including, I don't know, horse archers, and I don't know, there were, I don't know, longbowmen or crossbowmen that are this more agile troop that also fights in different contexts and so on. And you have the pikeman that also fights. So in all these, there's also this diversification of the tactical possibilities, and that is best, probably in this period we're talking about now, is best represented by the armies by the bandits d'ordonnance of the Burgundian army, about which I made a video that I can't find you. If you give me a second, I think it's both medieval warfare and medieval France. Yes, it is. So this is medieval formations, battle order of Charles the Bold's Burgundian army. That shows you that, because this tactical differentiation basically gave rise to extremely complex formations with many different tactical modules that could be changed. Obviously, yeah, you can argue that there is a practice of warfare that remains usually unaltered. One of the classical principles of war is simplicity. So ideally, it's not, especially towards the Renaissance, there was all this great speculation that, how can I find the perfect formation? But this is very theoretical, in fact. So we can imagine that in spite of these battle plans that have survived effectively, only very few of them were really, always used, and always so complex, actually. So definitely the art of war at this point was getting anything but radically changed, and also because in military history there are never such things like military revolutions. And please don't quote me, Parker, because it's something that we'll thank him for what is written, but definitely we don't. Of course, we consider the term military revolution controversial at best. People are obsessed by the term revolutions, especially in certain, specific areas of the world. Okay, also about this I will have to make a video. We'll take note. However, this increase in the need of specialization definitely brings the heavy cavalryman to become really heavy, so that you have by the 15th century this apex of the full plate armor knight and horse. I was saying this one before, there is a gap essentially between the time into which the full in which the plate armor starts appearing for the and developing in general for the cavalryman and for the horse. Indeed, if you say it, that full plate armor is something that starts appearing slightly before, like 50 years before the knight's armor is always like a bit ahead than the horse armor. Usually it's not something so probably mechanical as we can think. Probably they really went much more in parallel than what we can see. But if you really look when the plate armor began to appear into Europe, and also later now when the full plate armor began to appear, you realize that the knight was usually better protected than the horse on average. And this is kind of normal, because as sad as it can be, you want to be better protected than your horse. So even if your horse is in this sense more vulnerable, so this means that you can basically collapse together with the horses and crush yourself and your bones and everything. Especially just think of what it is, not just to fall from a horse, but to fall from a horse covered in full plate armor. It must be devastating. It adds up to the potential damage you can suffer. You still say, okay, well, let's hope this will not happen, and for now I prefer in the sense to take that risk, that being less protected than my horse, or at least to spend to invest more on the horse armor than my own. The So I think that the first surviving example of full plate armors, I mean, that we actually have is from roughly the 50s and the 60s of the 15th century. Oh, another problem, by the way, is that we have difficulties to date these finds, because it's not that easy, objectively, to say, was this, I don't know, from which year it was. It's not very easy, especially when we lack the firm on the armor, because you know that at that time the only, up to the end of the 15th century, basically the only European armor industry that had firms that kind of certified its products was the Lombard one, was the one from northern Italy, and was actually the only real industry. The only, you know, then things began to develop a little bit also in southern Germany, into France, into England, and so on. But sometimes we have accurate informations about certain armor just because we know it comes from Italy, that usually wrote, you know, I mean, engraved on the armor where this came from, where it was. So that's easier. With other, and it's, in this sense, it's also easier to date. With other areas of Europe, it's pretty difficult, and so we have even difficulty to know, you know, when this was done. And this is valid also for the Lombard industry as well, because it's not that also in there is the exact date, but at least from other hints we can perfect our knowledge about it. Beautiful. I think another I think one of the first evidence, at least, or even the first, we have this full plate armor in iconography is is from the Lucerne, the Shilling of Lucerne, depicting, I think, the Battle of Morat, which shows essentially these horses. Excuse me, I write down at which point of the video I'm discussing this, so I can show you the picture. So this would be 46. All right, that depicts, in fact, this plate armor. You can see it here. So in here we don't really know, is this armor? In the sense, is it metal? We don't know. Some people suggest that this could be also leather armor that similarly was much more widespread, also obviously, than metal armor. This is another point. We, aside from iconographical sources, we that also are very difficult to interpret relatively to the material this armor was actually made of. We get from archaeology usually mostly the metal parts that kind of survived more easily in time. Organic material is much more perishable, and therefore we lack most of its archaeological evidence for much time in history. But as we were saying before, probably, and in fact, this leather armor was extremely widespread, much more widespread than actually other the evidence at our disposal would suggest, because it's so easy to have something that protects you, and the actually boiled leather is something extremely resistant. It's not obviously as resistant as metal, but it's still something that can protect you from lots of things that can arrive at you in battle in terms of hits from any kind of weapon. And this is why it's so very useful. There are also beautiful, European armors. You find these beautiful things. I think of, for instance, of the early 16th century Burgundian horse armor that is preserved in the Tower of London. That is also a beautiful example. Also because, armor didn't really excessively change. Also from here, the late, the second half of the 15th century into the early 16th. The concept was practically the same. Consider, also another factor that we didn't talk about, but I think it's pretty normal, is, at this time, firearms start to become definitely more effective. So, actually, when you see the horse armor, the knight's armor evolution into this time, you realize, especially with the Maximilian style armor, that such armor was becoming increasingly elite, because the concept was creating essentially a full plate armor that could not hopefully be penetrated by arquebus shots. And initially it was definitely a thing, because the only way to penetrate this armor was to shoot with an arquebus from very close distance. Eventually, from the second half of the 6th century, you still find armor that was conceived like that and could even stop bullets. Most of the ones that would fly in the air could be stopped, but they were now starting to become also increasingly useless indeed, and that's why eventually armor was practically abandoned. And naturally, there are not just bullets, there are shells, there are every kind of debris that can hit you, and so it's always better to wear an armor if you are in this kind of environment. But you also have to consider how useful, how effective, also in terms of mobility, this can be. We have seen how heavy this armor could be, and what this entailed for the horses. So one of the advantages of cavalry in part is also speed. So even if this elite was conceived mostly to be held in reserve until the very crucial moments of battle, still, these horses had to be able to move. So it was actually a problem. And what you see, in fact, during the 30 Years' War, so we're actually pretty late in time, in the first half of the 16th century, when armor was still around, and then eventually in the second half basically vanishes at a massive level. At the beginning of the 18th century, practically don't find it anymore, if not for cuirassiers or for the officers and so on. You realize that also horse armor had partly disappeared. So basically you had this cuirassier that were riding fully armored, but now their horses weren't armored anymore. So this is very important to understand lots of things, also how the human mind works, that these guys wanted to be objectively protected by things like shells and mitraillettes, other things like that, but they sent their horses. Okay, having an armor like that for the horse is too expensive. It doesn't make me move essentially around the battlefield. It's better if I get armored only for myself, and my poor horse will just have to take everything that arrives at him. Also, this is an approximate concept, because there were still but there were certain resistances to this spread of firearms. For instance, in the second half of the 16th century, still find things like this weird things like this extremely thick metal shields that were used, they were extremely heavy, but they could hold some bullets indeed, but they were becoming so impractical that eventually were abandoned. And if you look even at today's police, you see that some of them actually have this very I don't know what they are, extremely heavy shields. They could be in lead even, I don't know, because those are meant to stop even bullets in part, but these are things that you basically have to push, and they're extremely heavy, and they're just used as a stationary defense, because it's not something you can run around, and they are used just in kind of very particular situations. So that is that the sense is that everything that protects you in theory can be useful at any time in history. But when we talk about great formations, great collective tactics, you need to make this thing move very pragmatically, so that it's not anymore about the individual strength. It's really about the whole group effectiveness, especially also in terms of mobility. That is definitely crucial. So coming back to the course bouillie, so the cooked boiled leather. It seems that this was the norm, especially into countries that traditionally had very few metal resources compared to others, like Italy, for instance. We have seen that Italy had this flourishing armor industry that in fact was in the north, because that was basically together with some places in the Tuscan islands where there were substantial metal iron mines, essentially. So these were like Milan or Brescia, were the cities that were exporting armor literally all over Europe at this time, and that had dominated the market since, I think, the 13th century, even before probably. And however, Italy as a whole system had less available metal than other countries, than some other countries, and this brought essentially to, and this also has to do partly with some climatic reasons, perhaps being Italy warmer than other areas, even wearing a very very heavy metal armor. Think in summer it's something that can be exhausting. As a matter of fact, what I was saying is that leather armor was extremely widespread in here than in other countries. This is something you can find it many times in history. For instance, during the 13th century, when in fact plate armor was developing, especially in Germany, and you find this, and also into northern Italy in part. You find instead into central Italy this so-called Tuscan Angevin style that is referred to the fact that at this time the Guelph system that ruled hegemonically into the greatest part of Western Europe was represented by this alliance between the Angevins, essentially the French, and this Tuscan bloc of very wealthy cities, including Florence and so on, that in this sense it exchanged a lot in terms of military, also in material culture practically. And there is this Tuscan Angevin style that, differently from the German one that was pointing especially on the heavy and the weightening of the armor in metal and so on, starts instead to be a bit more agile, and made extensive use of leather armor, of parts of armor that that were usually combined, was both metal and leather. But never underestimate environmental factors, because actually we have evidence in many sources, contemporary sources at the time, that sometimes, especially in summer, knights couldn't stand wearing armor. It was something extremely uncomfortable. There were people who really got cooked into their own armor. They collapsed and died of syncopes and stuff like that because they were overheated. So sometimes, it's not really strange. It's something that happened because you have to really imagine these physical factors to be overwhelming sometimes. Some of them went, even in spite of having metal armor, they didn't wear in battle. You might say, what? Yeah. Which actually supports what a little bit was I was saying before, is that also sometimes it's better to work better as a formation, and in this sense, like neglecting what the individual is doing, so that if a charge is carried out properly, it might be more effective, even if it's if their cavalrymen are lightly armored, because maybe they're more agile and they have more energies. Instead, the guy who's cooking inside his armor is going to be exhausted by that sheer fact and can be less effective. So these are things that also happened in part, and this is not certainly, obviously Italy was warmer, so that, for instance, war was fought for more time during the year. Normally in Italy the hostilities started in March, whereas in Northern Europe usually war started in May. Obviously there were exceptions for this, but you have to take into consideration that this was mostly not really related to the weather, as what the knights felt. It was mostly a problem of the pastures for the horses, because obviously the harvest and North of Europe happens later in time, because in that sense it's influenced by the so this by the climate, but this is in fact mostly a logistical thing. But even, you know, indeed campaigning, I don't know, into the Mediterranean in summer is, you know, really a much hotter experience than doing it, I don't know, into Northern Europe, into Scandinavia. So these are also things that have to be kept in mind. And always remember that the Gambazon, that both the knights and the horses war was meant in this sense to isolate both from cold and from hot. So actually in your armor you can freeze as well, so it can be pretty uncomfortable. Also, you need necessarily something that is, you know, you can't make your skin rub with the iron, because that's gonna cause you, you know, very very serious problems as well, like you know, bruises and so on. And that's the reason why cotton was usually employed for kilted armor, because it's notoriously an insulation practically. So in fact, you'd be surprised that, I don't know, in the Bedouins of the desert usually wear wool, because the outside, that's also very isolating. So so because sometimes the weather outside is so hot that wool basically preserves your, you know, your inner temperature as the one of the human body, because it's consistently fresher than what it's outside, so more than 37 degrees. So it's a bit like this with the you know, with the other padded clothes and so on. So, and as we were saying before, we don't know excessively much, especially about this leather armor, and however, this especially in Italy, as we've seen, this was pretty common. In fact, during the especially at the beginning of the wars of Italy, when Charles VIII invaded the Italian peninsula, this boiled leather armor is depicted and referred to in many pictures and written sources that prove us that probably this was much more widespread than we can think. Another characteristics of this plate armor is that it was usually physically built into blocks that were kept together by the saddle. This was extremely important because having a unique chunk of armor could make the horse a bit less flexible. Instead, it's really important also for the horse to move pretty easily, and to have this joint of his belly essentially, separating the basin and the chest, so that it can move more easily. And that's very important because the horse, by the way, in warfare is extremely dynamic. You never think the horse is just like driving a motorcycle. The horse does, he has his own mind. He does very active things also in combat. Horses kick, bite, throw punches with your hand. If someone approaches you, he's gonna bite the enemy literally, and horses can't really, just get kicked by a horse. You can't have your head broken quite easily. So it's these animals were actually also trained for doing such things. So the horse could be really a deadly thing. And if you wonder why the horses had this sometimes in this in their chafrans, in this plate armor, had this spike over their forehead, that's exactly because the horse would throw a punch with its head on the enemy and pierce him, hopefully with that spike. and other horses as well, because horses in fact aggress each other in this context. They punch themselves, they're pretty aggressive, pretty dynamic, so you want the horse to be extremely agile. And in fact, something that is being at least for us it's notorious, that despite this full plate armor weighted a freaking lot, they were still extremely flexible in many ways, and the medieval technology was extremely good at this. They had these various you know, I don't know how to say it, twisting point, I don't know, that made the armor flexible. So all these series of lamellae that were maintained a bit flexible, one with each other, with certain leather straps, and with a just with a skeleton that was actually riveted, so that even the gorge protection, the I think the crinet is called, it was pretty much flexible. The same goes actually for the crupper. So it would be the part of the defense of the horse thigh. And between these two blocks, in fact, of the petrol and the crupper, that were actually the largest parts of the horse armor, and they were also ones that had the larger plates. There was the flanchard or flanchière. This the French vocabulary at this time also was pretty rising into military affairs towards the Renaissance, and the interesting fact is this this flanchard essentially were a little essentially there were two plate armors that were put between under the saddle, between the chest and the butt armor of the horse, and these were shaped in a fashion that obviously the main problem was to defend the horse flank, that hence the name of flanchard, the soft the belly. But they were shaped into a fashion that were you see here in pictures that it was arched in along the bottom edge, basically to allow the knight to use the spurs on the horse belly. So you know that how spurs work, they just spike the poor animal so that it gets stimulated, and that was very important naturally, because that was one of the best ways to direct the horse together with the reins, but also with the voice, because the horses some of them are extremely obedient. They also are trained to respond to the knight's voice, and you have always to remember there is a kind of even mystical relation between the knight and his horse, so that you have to trust your horse. You don't have a good cavalry if you have a good horse and a bad knight, or a bad horse and a good knight. They have to be both good, and they both have to trust each other, because the horse knows that you're taking him into battle. Don't think it's just a passive thing, that he knows you're going to fight with him and he's going to fight for you. So you have both to, you have to trust both of each other while you go to such things, and this is very important. So relatively to the flexibility of the armor that we hinted at before, first of all, I think it's known that full plate armor was built in a fashion that allowed the knights to do every kind of acrobacies that was possible to do. With full plate armor you can do easily a cabriole, a somersault, a flip. You can do really everything because it's so flexible. Yes, it weighs. It does weigh. Also, the myth that when you wear full plate armor you don't feel it because it's so agile. No, you do feel it, and it's something really exhausting. But the weight is so well distributed that this exhaustion is, mostly an entire thing. It doesn't stress any specific part of your body more than much, so that you can be flexible and just, if you're a bit more muscular and you're trained to basically to move into it, it can feel very make you feel very comfortable. But indeed, wearing this armor is still pretty heavy, so sometimes even these knights that fell off from the horse were, just think of the shock, because it was not just a physical thing, it's also a psychological thing. You're in the middle of the battle, I don't know, in the 14th century, in the 15th century battlefield. Just imagine smokes, shout, guts spilled, pikes pointing at you, and I don't know, your horse get hit by a cannonball, you fall onto the ground. Just think about the shock of having even the same violent shock of falling down with all the full plate armor on. And we have many evidence of many accounts of full plate of armor, of knights that were falling into the ground with this very heavy full plate armor that couldn't rise once again. Because they were shocked at that point. Some of these people were also old. One thing is to wear this armor when you're 20 or 30. One thing is, when you're 50 or 60 or even more. Actually, we have evidence of knights that fought even into their 80s, into battles. So that's not an easy play. And just think that some of these knights were literally lifted with a crane over the horses, because they were so heavy, especially when the tournament armor that was extra safe, and also because everything was much more staged into the jousts. Nevertheless, they were still very dangerous. They were overloaded in armor, so the main thing was just to remain on the horse, and there were special cranes for putting you on a horse. So just think of sometimes how this was, how physical these matters really are. But nevertheless, especially those armor conceived for combat, so when a lot of physical dynamism is required, we're extremely flexible, and we have an extraordinary evidence that comes from the Harnischmeister Albrecht, who was basically Maximilian the First of Habsburg armor. So this is essentially this German picture, I think painted around the 80s of the 15th century. So here we are in this timeline that depicting a horse in complete plate armor that even includes its legs. Yay! So basically, when you see this, this full plate armor for horses in, I don't know, into armories and so on, and usually their legs are naked. That's also a thing, and we had this depiction that arrived to us, and some people said, well, this is, I think it's present in the Zeug house in Vienna, actually, and people said, well, maybe this was just a bizarre thought, the idea of having a like this plate armor also for the horse's legs. And so instead it was found by the Viscount de Lyon cuissard, so this thigh piece that resembles actually the one in Albrecht's picture, and that is, I think, now in Brussels, the Musée de la Porte des Halles. It should be, at least. I don't know if it's been moved, but it should be there. Which actually, we don't know if it is the same one from Albrecht's armor like it was depicted at the time, but it's definitely an evidence that at least this armor was realized. So you had basically the horse in full, complete armor, even for their legs. And let me give a look to the picture 1 second. So even, well, not the hooves that were still, you know, pretty solid on their own and with iron on it. But look at how nice it is actually. And in fact, Maximilian's armors were famous at this point because they were a bit the apex of at the time of armoredness of full protection. And you can see how beautifully decorated these things are. So relatively to this last point, and also another thing that I like always to remember, to intrigue people, is how much these things were actually beautiful to see. How decorated they were. The plate armor, and we actually have evidence of this, there's plenty of it, because we have the originals, were painted. Normally also mail was painted. You know, you don't have to think of medieval knights in coat of mail like all grey, or some were black because they were just they had the bluing essentially for avoiding oxidation. So also the myth of the Black Knight, that's where it originated from, not because, you know, it was a guy who at a certain point decided to paint his armor black. It's because it was normal sometimes to do it in this way. But the mail, if you look at the Manessa code, that gives you, but there are other sources of course, that gives you a beautiful example of this. Coat of mail were all, I don't know, in colors like yellow, red, blue, green, and this went along with this show-off, because naturally the knights were usually coming from, in fact, an aristocratic background. They all had their own heraldry, their code of place, that they wanted to look good, they wanted to look intimidating, and also their headgear with these symbols represent. So they were extremely colored for, extremely beautiful to watch. And plate armor was just the same. And for being, I mean, how do you say that, polished, or, you know, having a smooth surface, naturally the plate was much more, you know, adaptable to these paintings, these more elaborated paintings. So actually it's full of evidence of this. There was plenty of colors, plenty of symbols. Some were embossed, engraved as well, and some of the most beautiful horse armor are actually in line in this sense, with their decorations with the same one of their knight. So there's beautiful art also attached to this, and there was sometimes also some tissue, some textile that was attached to the plate armor. So looking, I don't know, to you can use textile, painted leather, gilt fringes, mail trappers, and so on. And so this can be really very, very beautiful to watch, and it was naturally very expensive to do. Only the elite would, you know, waste, say, money in this fact. But as in old times, there were also parades, parade armors. Sometimes were also weapons that were not meant to be used into combat, that however showed into parades. This happened at all times. So also in here we have to stay sharp and try to understand what was actually used into battle, what wasn't. And unfortunately, we have lost probably much knowledge about these tiny little details that, however, were very important also for in terms of what the practice of combat really was, and so on. I don't know what I could add now. I think not much. Generally speaking, I think I've said everything I wanted to say now. I could add something more relatively to the actual progression and arrangement that this was reached, because if you look at the first examples of horse armor, you realize that even plate armor is nothing conceptually different from any other armor. I mean, it's not. It obviously presents certain technical and technological problems in order to be achieved. It requires a certain form of developed in engineering, of also of a degree of evolution of metallurgy and so on. The same plate armor stemmed from this evolution. It also, however, and as always, means something also political and social. So who were those who wore this armor? Well, obviously this was the ultra elite. And this was happening in a world like indeed the 15th century one, into which not just lordships but also states were developing. So the idea of having a royal armory, for instance, that could produce also in en masse such equipment, relatively en masse, because naturally this was it was like owning a private jet. Objectively, even more, I think, by certain standards, and this was an elite that also on the battlefields was really the cream of the society and so on. Just thinking about, I don't know, the Battle of Pavia, all the French noblemen that were slaughtered in the end, they belonged to this, all these. And when Francis I was captured, in fact, they all were mounted on this thing. Sometimes they were also difficultly to recognize, because at that time also, there were certain officers and flag bearers that are usually stationed close to the king. But you have to think of the nobility at the time being still extremely cocky and arrogant, and wanting essentially to compete in magnificence with the king, and also indeed hoping to get his place one day, politically speaking. So it was also a matter of showing off. Showing this extremely heavy armor was also a way to say, look at how rich I am, how powerful I am, and don't mess with me. So just besides being very intimidating, just from a sheer combat point of view. Another detail that I skipped is that initially, naturally, plate armor, this is valid both for men and horses, included parts of mail. There were usually placed in areas that were less, for instance, the crenate sometimes on the horse's neck was made in mail. This is like how the first also plate armor for men started. There were plates that were joined by pieces of mail at a certain point. Initially, mail was built practically was worn underneath these plates. I mean, the plate originated by having a guy in mail armor and then having just a plate put on his chest or somewhere else, and progressively structuring. Then, since this was becoming increasingly heavy, someone thought, in fact, to join the plates with mail and not to have mail underneath the plate, because that was already enough, actually, to protect yourself decently. So also with improvements in metallurgy and so on, there is this progressive disappearing of the mail for this, and reaching the full plate armor. Indeed, then mail naturally kept existing for a very long time. It's something you found also, I don't know, in the 20th century in some places in the world. So it's not really anything strange, but that's how the armor evolved. I can't think of much else I could say now. I'm sure that there's plenty of things to say There are beautiful studies about this topics, and I'm not extremely passionate about strictly technical things, or especially metallurgy and so on, but definitely you can find much more. Another thing that was very important is the embossing. Now the embossing is, as I said, this armor was extremely heavy, so the embossing can first of all take away part of the weight from the armor. At the same time, it can give certain physical strengths to the structure, especially when there are certain veins, etc. So that can reinforce certain parts. So you can put, more metal in some places and less in others. The word is kind of also, I don't know how to say, these waves on the armor. So that the idea was that the blades or every hit that arrived at the horse basically wouldn't arrive straight 90 degrees at the horse, so increasing the chances of diverting the synetical and dispersing also in different directions synetical energy. So this was a very clever way also to make the armor less penetrable, and also sometimes lighter even. Yeah, I think we're done in here. Whatever. There are also other things related to naturally the tournaments, as in the jousts, or the melees as well. There were different types of armor that were used in a certain way. Also, the saddle was, elaborated in different ways. So there was also this. Sometimes even the lances at this point were becoming so heavy that there were these lance rests mounted up on carved into the archon of the saddle as well. This began not just in tournaments but also in warfare, when the lance became literally too heavy to be used by a single arm. So just to give you even the dimension of how many physical force was entailed by, the horse is quite a big animal. These were pretty tough breeds. You have all this armor on, so just think to be launched even at 30 kilometers per hour with such a huge weight. Just think at the impacts that could exist. There was something devastating, and that's the reason also why this armor was so thick and heavy, because objectively that you had to be well protected to enter in something like that, into fights like those. And even jousts were in fact extremely dangerous business, and for not talking about the melees, they were practically a battle simulation by certain standards. So just imagine also about the spin-off that the production of such armor entailed. I mean, all the tournaments and all, the business that was done around them, all the people who worked for the knights to field this armor, to train. There was a lot of, this time, duels were extremely famous. It was all a tradition of, of chivalry that at this point entailed also the competition of who had this best armor, also for the horses and so on. So it was really a world. It was, first of all, getting very princely in nature. If there was a still very strong chivalric code at this time, was naturally setting pace to the commoner warfare, to the modern warfare. The idea that pike and shot now was emerging, so also chivalry was kind of dying, especially from this perspective of the heavy cavalry as dominator of the battlefields. Now with Renaissance square pike square formations and arquebuses and artillery, but everything was practically changing. But nevertheless, and this is practically also what it augmented the level of the elite. This is the point. The Renaissance warfare practically emerges from a world that was stratifying itself at the point you needed a state to move this enormous and unprecedented quantity of resources that served to fuel a Renaissance army in terms, thousands of pikemen, this ultra-elite cavalry, the siege train, the artillery park, the supplies, the ammo, think about the black powder, how costly that was. So now a centralized state was developing in order to cope with this with these expenses, and in parallel with this state, it was the same monarchy and the aristocracies that were progressively, increasingly rising to the top. So also these fully armored knights were representing an elite that was rising to the top of a society that was increasingly more aristocratic than it had been before by certain standards, because paradoxically the feudal times were knights were a bit more equal among each other. Even kings, as we were saying before, were sometimes just a king was a primus inter pares in many ways. Now the state is being formed, the monarchy is being idolized, there is a mystics of monarchy and so on. So it's as if everything was increasingly more refined, and these horses had to to be equipped in accordingly in this sense. That was just a little addition. I will be talking again about horse armor in the future. It's pretty normal, I think. We have to get into detail with these things, because it's important really to make you understand also how these troops worked on the battlefield. And there are so many meaningful details about these equipments that can help you doing such a thing. So for now, however, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.